know, it's always fun when you get to do your own work, particularly when it's on a lovely site on the Adriatic in a balmy temperate place, which doesn't always happen. And this is a project, or rather this is a plan, a city plan, that I wanted to show you because it's a case of a lot of different forces coming together. It's probably it is the only planned papal new town. And in architectural history and urban history, a new town means something specific. Not just that it's new, it's an ex novo, built from nothing construction, but also that it's built with some sort of idealistic content. Whether it's a utopian city, whether it's a city or town meant to revolve around trade, a town or city, particularly in the Renaissance in Italy, many of these ideal or new towns were built by wealthy dukes, warlords, condottieri, is another word for them, various counts who really wanted to physically, put their imprint on the landscape to demonstrate how cultured they were, because in many ways these new towns, even though there's a strand in here, and I'll walk you through it, that traces back to what are called Bastide towns, and the word Bastide simply comes from the French bâtir, to build. And these Bastide towns, which actually tended to look a little bit like Cervia, this is a whole other strand of urbanism that goes back to the early Middle Ages, when usually kings would sort of build a fortified, essentially sort of an urban-scaled castle to protect, their territorial claim to a certain area. So what I'm going to show you today is sort of a conflation of a couple different ideas, and a town that I found by accident, actually, when I was on the Adriatic, and I thought, wait a minute, there's something very peculiar about this place. And once I started researching it, I realized that as a Saltworks, and I don't know, has anyone ever read that book? The author's name escapes me. It's called Salt. The history of an idea, and it sort of talks about the global importance throughout history of the production, trade, and consumption of salt. Salt as essentially something that was worth its weight in, maybe not its weight in gold, but something close to it. And Cervia is actually a papal, it's built on the site of, and it encompasses a papal saltworks. The papacy had the monopoly on salt production in this area. So there are economic interests, there are all kinds of interests, but what I'm going to try to do is sort of weave back and forth between sort of the historical, theory-driven, let's look at the form of the city, and the more pragmatic issue, which is how were the patrons, in other words, the papacy, how were they seeking to build their own ideal city, and how did it actually turn out, which is actually, in some ways, even more interesting. Now, Cervia Nuova, or New Cervia, which is the town that we're going to look at, which you see sort of the initial plan before any of the building commenced. As I said before, it certainly has some elements of, and I'll take you back through the history in a second. It has some, thank you. That's not true. You guys all right? Eating in the dark? Okay. It certainly has some aspects of a Bastide town. This is a 13th century town in southwestern France called Montpensier. And just to show you some of the basic outlines, it's a big, yikes, I don't know what's doing that. It's a big, big rectangle, gates, right? City wall, gates. Once you entered a gate, you were expected, if you were bringing goods into the town, you were expected to pay some sort of a toll on them. So the gates were incredibly important. And as you can see, this town is laid out in an absolutely dead, uniform grid. Now, we've got some city students here today. I'm gonna reach back in time. Gaurav, how far back can you trace the grid?
I think Trajan city in Algeria?
Yes, Trajan and even earlier, so circa 100 AD. very good, the Roman grid. The ancient Romans, when they built their military garrisons throughout Europe, as they sort of swept through Europe and swept through the Middle East, swept through northern Africa, up into England, the garrison cities that they built were on a strict grid so that military commanders and their associates could find their way easily as they went from one city to another. And also because the grid made a lot of sense. And this tradition actually can trace it all the way back to ancient Greece and a tradition called Hippodamian planning that goes back to about the 5th century BC. So let's shoot forward. So a Bastide plan, okay, this was actually a market town. You can see sort of a covered, in the plan, the dark refers to building plots. You know, in a plan, usually when you see dark, dark lines, it refers to some sort of built fabric, sort of like a horizontal cut through a city. These actually show you a whole series of covered arcades where people could bring their produce and sell it. Here's an actual little market building itself. And you can tell, this actually is the church, and the fact that the church is pushed off the main square tells you that this town's main reason for being was the market and trade. Okay, so this is a Bastide town. It was built in southern France, as I said, right around 1285 or so, by Edward I. Now in Italy, there wasn't so much a Bastide tradition as there was what was known as an ideal town tradition that begins in the Renaissance. Here's a really great example of that tradition. It's called a centralized plan for obvious reasons. You know, it's built around some central element. It's radially symmetrical, and in this case, this is the city of Palmanova, which is in the extreme northeast corner of the Italian, modern-day Italy, very near Slovenia. And you can see that the main feature is central, in this case, a central hexagonal piazza, and all these radial roads leading into it, and then grouped around this piazza, you'd see, you know, the church, the bishop's palace, the market, the town hall, everything that went with it. And Palmanova was actually built in the late 16th century. You can see just a little bit of the intended fortifications. Ultimately, in the Renaissance, on the Italian peninsula, you can trace a lot of this, a lot of the formal, i.e. the form-related interest in these designs, back to something known as humanism. Okay, the interest, the research and interest in the humanities that thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Leon Battista Alberti, who was a mid 15th century Italian writer, philosopher, sort of amateur architect. And you've all seen this before, I'm sure, in many different forms, both straightforward and otherwise. But Leonardo's the so-called Vitruvian man image is a really compelling one, because part of what Leonardo is saying is something fairly revolutionary, right? That man, you know, and mankind, you know, men and women, at least in their ideal form, correspond to or are created as sort of a mirror of perfect form, perfect geometries, what are also called Platonic geometries, after Plato's interest in sort of divinely received form. So the idea that you can inscribe a well-proportioned man in a perfect circle, which is a Platonic form, or, you know, depending on how he's standing up, in a perfect square. So these centralized plans, these plans that revolved around squares, circles, and you know, other types, even rectangles, tended to reflect this sort of newly hopeful literary interest in the idea that there's something, you know, we're not just sort of waiting to sort of meekly go through our life under the thumb of the church, and, you know, as long as we sort of follow the norms of forms of traditional worship, you know, if we're lucky, we'll be resurrected. This is something bigger. This is linking mankind to something essentially pagan, ideal, and more especially to